Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. I'm also curious, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? Now settle in, get comfortable, let the world slow down. Amelia Torres was born on February 14, 1983, in Sacramento, California, to parents Marcia and Leonard Torres. Her early years were filled with the warmth of a close-knit family, particularly with her mother, Marcia, who often recounted stories of her own childhood while Amelia sat by her side, listening intently. Amelia grew into a bright, affectionate, and independent woman, traits that remained evident even as her life became increasingly complicated. At 28, she would marry Thomas Whitman, a man 20 years her senior, whose past would later cast an ominous shadow over the family they would build together. Thomas had a history few would overlook. Born in 1961, he had a criminal record rooted in unspeakable acts committed decades before he met Amelia. Convicted of multiple counts of child abuse in the late 1980s, Thomas had spent a significant portion of his life behind bars. His name remained on California's sex offender registry, a fact Amelia was aware of before marrying him. Yet, despite the warnings of friends and family, she chose to start a life with him, believing in the idea that people could change. The couple settled in a modest suburban home in Rosewood, Oregon, after relocating to escape the scrutiny of Thomas's past. Amelia pursued higher education, enrolling at the local community college, while Thomas worked from home as a mechanic, repairing cars for neighbors and friends. Their household quickly filled with the sounds of children, laughter, and at times tension that simmered beneath the surface. Their first child, Lucas Whitman, was born on March 2, 2005. Bright, inquisitive, and creative, Lucas quickly distinguished himself among his peers. His teachers often marveled at his ability to construct intricate toys and imaginative models, often gifting them to classmates or using them to create art projects for his siblings. A year later, on April 10th, their second child, Nathan, arrived. Nathan shared his brother's creativity, particularly excelling in reading and storytelling. His fascination with animated trains became a defining aspect of his early childhood. The family continued to grow with the birth of their third child, Benjamin, on June 20, 2007. Unlike his older brothers, Benjamin's focus gravitated more toward action figures and miniature cars, spending hours immersing himself in superhero adventures and imaginative play. The youngest of the family, Clara, was born on February 5, 2010. As the only daughter, Clara became the center of her parents' attention. Her early years spent exploring the world through play and learning, often accompanied by dolls and storybooks. Amelia's relationship with her children was deep and affectionate. Her mother, Marcia, recalled countless late-night phone calls filled with laughter, storytelling, and songs shared across the distance. Amelia's warmth and dedication made her children feel secure, even as the undercurrents of tension in her household remained hidden from the outside world. Neighbors described the Whitman home as lively but occasionally volatile. Arguments between Amelia and Thomas were reportedly frequent, though they never escalated into physical violence. Child Protective Services had been called to their address on several occasions, though the specific reasons were never publicly disclosed. Some neighbors mentioned that while Thomas was polite and seemingly quiet, his presence could feel unnerving, and there was a pervasive tension that lingered in the home. The Whitman children thrived in small ways despite these challenges. Lucas, 7 at the time of the tragedy, was already showing remarkable ingenuity, crafting complex toys and sharing them generously with his friends. Nathan, 6, excelled academically, his early reading and writing abilities beyond grade level, while Benjamin, 5, was immersed in imaginative play with superhero figurines and miniature cars. Clara, too, remained the cherished baby of the family, enjoying playtime with dolls and early childhood activities. The family's routine, however, was disrupted on a late summer evening in 2011. Amelia, weary from constant arguments with Thomas and seeking time for herself, stayed out later than expected. She had expressed her intentions to friends and relatives that she was considering ending the marriage. Thomas reported her missing the following morning, setting off a chain of events that would lead to one of the most harrowing tragedies in Rosewood. Amelia was found later that morning at a convenience store near her home. Surveillance footage showed her calmly purchasing a few small items while on her cell phone, seemingly unaware of the alarm her absence had caused. She appeared relaxed, chatting with the clerk, and moving through the store in a composed manner. The police escorted her home shortly afterward, where she reunited with Thomas without displaying any apparent fear or urgency. Within the hour, a neighbor noticed smoke rising from the Whitman residence. Calvin Morris, who lived directly across the street, attempted to alert the family by pounding on the front door, but received no response. When emergency responders arrived, they discovered flames emanating from multiple locations within the house. Firefighters were forced to break through doors and windows to reach the interior, where the scene quickly turned chaotic. The front yard of the Whitman home became an impromptu triage area. Firefighters and paramedics worked feverishly to rescue the family, pulling them from the burning structure and attempting resuscitation. It was immediately evident that multiple victims had suffered fatal injuries before the fire began. Stab wounds were discovered on Amelia and her 3 boys, indicating that the crime had occurred prior to the blaze. Clara, the youngest, along with Lucas, succumbed to the effects of the fire. Amelia and the other 2 boys were pronounced dead at the hospital. Thomas, the sole survivor, was found unconscious from smoke inhalation. A bloody knife lay near him, suggesting his direct involvement in the events that unfolded. First responders noted that he had attempted to end his own life using the stove and by self-inflicted injuries. His actions immediately raised questions about premeditation, motive, and the true sequence of events. Autopsy reports revealed disturbing details. The children had been given significant doses of melatonin, suggesting an intent to sedate them before the attack. The injuries inflicted on Amelia and her sons were extensive and brutal, signaling a crime committed in a state of intense anger and loss of control. Investigators concluded that Thomas had planned the attack meticulously, attempting to eliminate his family before taking his own life in the flames. Neighbors and friends were left reeling. The tragedy of the Whitman family exposed a hidden darkness behind what appeared to be a typical suburban household. Thomas's past, once a footnote in public records, now became a central element in understanding the motivations and risks associated with his actions. The incident shocked the community and drew attention to the patterns of abuse and mental instability that often precede familial violence. Amelia's extended family, particularly her father, Leonard Torres, spoke candidly about the failings of the justice system. He described how past crimes often went unaddressed effectively and how systemic gaps could leave families vulnerable. He also reflected on the potential for redemption, emphasizing the importance of learning from tragedy to prevent future occurrences. In the days following the fire, the community mourned. Candlelight vigils were held, flowers and personal mementos were left at the site of the former Whitman residence, and local news outlets covered the story extensively. Amelia and her children were buried side by side, a solemn reminder of the lives lost too soon. The aftermath of the Whitman tragedy highlighted numerous systemic failures, from oversight in monitoring offenders to the limitations of child protection services. It also raised critical questions about domestic violence, mental health, and the responsibility of the community in identifying warning signs. Amelia's life, though tragically cut short, left a legacy of love, creativity, and dedication to her children, a stark contrast to the violence that would ultimately consume them. Even in death, Amelia's presence continued to resonate. Friends, neighbors, and family members recalled her warmth, humor, and unwavering devotion to her children. Her memory became a symbol not only of the tragedy, but also of resilience, the profound impact of parental love, and the urgent need for vigilance to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The investigation into the Whitman family tragedy began immediately after Thomas Whitman was pulled from the burning home. Firefighters and police had barely put out the flames when forensic teams arrived to document the scene. The house itself was heavily damaged, smoke and soot coating every surface, and yet investigators could clearly see the signs of premeditated violence. Multiple fire starters had been placed throughout the home, and evidence suggested Thomas had carefully planned the attack over several hours. Forensic analysis revealed chilling details. The sedative found in the children's systems, melatonin, was administered in doses far exceeding recommended amounts. Clara, the youngest, had 4 times the suggested dose, which pointed to an intent to immobilize the children before the violent act. Lucas, Nathan, and Benjamin had also been subdued, ensuring that they could not resist or escape. The methodical nature of the sedation indicated a horrifying level of forethought, suggesting this was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a planned annihilation. Medical examiners noted the nature of the injuries inflicted on Amelia and her sons. Amelia had sustained multiple stab wounds across her torso and neck, while Lucas, Nathan, and Benjamin had been stabbed repeatedly as well. The wounds were deep and precise, suggesting a loss of control fueled by intense anger and possibly jealousy or fear. Clara, spared from the stabbing, died from the fire, trapped in the bedroom with her sedated siblings. Investigators later described the scene as one of the most chilling they had ever encountered. Police officers interviewed neighbors who had witnessed unusual activity in the hours leading up to the fire. Several neighbors recalled hearing loud arguments coming from the Whitman home in the days prior, though none had suspected that such violence would escalate to this level. Calvin Morris, the neighbor who called 911, said that when he first saw smoke, he pounded on the door, fearing the worst. By the time emergency crews arrived, the fire was already spreading aggressively. Authorities also examined Thomas's past. His criminal record, publicized widely, was no secret. He had been convicted in California decades earlier for multiple counts of child sexual abuse and had served nearly 20 years in prison. Upon release, he moved frequently and attempted to rebuild his life. Despite his criminal history, he had managed to marry Amelia and establish a family. Prosecutors and the community alike would later question how someone with such a violent past was able to live relatively undetected and start a family. Thomas himself became the primary suspect almost immediately. Found unconscious from smoke inhalation but clutching a bloodied knife, his survival did little to obscure his culpability. Investigators believed that he had set multiple fires intentionally, using cooking oil as an improvised accelerant. The stove and oven had also been activated in an attempt to cause additional harm to the home and possibly himself. First responders described the effort to pull him from the home as tense and dangerous. His movements were erratic, and the knife indicated he may have been attempting to continue his violence even as firefighters worked to save him. Once stabilized in the hospital, Thomas was closely monitored by law enforcement. Police suspected that he had planned every step of the massacre, from sedating the children to stabbing them and starting the fire. Interviews with surviving neighbors, family, and friends painted a picture of a man increasingly controlling, obsessive, and fearful of losing his family. Amelia's intentions to leave him and file for divorce were reportedly known to those close to her, making jealousy and possessiveness plausible motives. Detectives meticulously reconstructed the timeline of the tragedy. Surveillance footage, store receipts, and cell phone records confirmed that Amelia had left the house the morning of the fire and returned calmly, unaware of the imminent danger. Thomas reportedly had planned the attack for that morning, waiting until she returned home to ensure he would have control over the situation. The precision and preparation indicated premeditation, reinforcing the theory that the murders were deliberate and not accidental. Family members grappled with the devastating reality. Leonard Torres, Amelia's father, was overwhelmed with grief. He struggled to reconcile the loving daughter he knew with the violent circumstances of her death. Leonard's own experiences with family violence, having lost siblings years earlier, added layers of complexity to his emotions. While he recognized Thomas's criminal culpability, he also expressed concerns about systemic failures. The fact that someone with Thomas's past could marry, start a family, and commit such a heinous act highlighted gaps in the monitoring and rehabilitation of offenders. Detectives meticulously reconstructed the timeline of the tragedy. Surveillance footage, store receipts, and cell phone records confirmed that Amelia had left the house the morning of the fire and returned calmly, unaware of the imminent danger. Thomas reportedly had planned the attack for that morning, waiting until she returned home to ensure he would have control over the situation. The precision and preparation indicated premeditation, reinforcing the theory that the murders were deliberate and not accidental. Family members grappled with the devastating reality. Leonard Torres, Amelia's father, was overwhelmed with grief. He struggled to reconcile the loving daughter he knew with the violent circumstances of her death. Leonard's own experiences with family violence, having lost siblings years earlier, added layers of complexity to his emotions. While he recognized Thomas's criminal culpability, he also expressed concerns about systemic failures. The fact that someone with Thomas's past could marry, start a family, and commit such a heinous act highlighted gaps in the monitoring and rehabilitation of offenders. The legal proceedings moved slowly, but the evidence against Thomas was overwhelming. Authorities charged him with multiple counts of aggravated murder, including special circumstances due to the victims' ages and the multiplicity of murders. Additional charges of arson and manslaughter were also filed. The potential sentences ranged from life imprisonment without parole to potentially the death penalty. Given the nature of the crimes, the case quickly garnered national attention. During pre-trial hearings, Thomas's defense team attempted to argue a disturbing but not uncommon claim that Amelia had somehow been involved in the children's deaths. He claimed she had threatened the children and that his actions were a misguided attempt to stop further harm. Experts in family annihilation cases noted that this type of defense often emerges from perpetrators attempting to shift blame, portraying themselves as heroes reacting to imagined threats. Prosecutors, however, dismissed the claims as manipulative and unfounded. District Attorney Clara Hastings described Thomas as selfish, controlling, and jealous, asserting that he had killed his family to prevent Amelia from leaving him. She emphasized the methodical sedation, stabbing, and arson all pointed to a deliberate plan to annihilate those closest to him. Evidence presented in court included autopsy reports, eyewitness testimony, forensic analysis of the home, and Thomas's own statements at the scene. Judge Richard Callahan characterized the case as one of the most egregious examples of domestic violence escalating to lethal levels. While the courtroom proceedings unfolded, Amelia's family struggled to process their grief. Leonard Torres, as well as Amelia's brother Miguel and sister Rosa, leaned on their faith and community for support. They emphasized forgiveness as a path towards healing, though it was a struggle to reconcile their beliefs with the enormity of the tragedy. Public statements from the family encouraged awareness of domestic violence and the importance of addressing warning signs before they escalated into lethal outcomes. Leonard spoke candidly about the failings of the justice system, reflecting on how Thomas's history had been inadequately monitored after his release from prison. He also discussed the personal toll the tragedy had taken, acknowledging both his grief and a desire for systemic change. No parent should ever have to bury their child at 7 or 5 or 2. The system failed Amelia and her children. We need to ensure that families are protected before it's too late. Community support emerged as a vital lifeline. Local organizations, churches, and neighbors organized fundraisers and memorials to assist with funeral costs and provide counseling to the surviving family members. The Whitman Children's Schools and teachers offered resources to help siblings, cousins, and friends cope with the shock of losing their peers. Social workers emphasized the importance of addressing trauma early, particularly for those who had been close to the Whitman family. As the trial date approached, prosecutors presented a compelling case, relying on forensic evidence, witness accounts, and Thomas's own contradictory statements. Defense attorneys continued to argue diminished responsibility and attempted to frame the murders as a response to perceived threats from Amelia, but the weight of evidence was too strong to counter. Psychological evaluations painted Thomas as someone with deep-seated issues related to control, jealousy, and violent impulses, which had been exacerbated by unresolved criminal tendencies. The trial also examined broader societal issues. Experts testified about the challenges of monitoring convicted sex offenders, the limitations of parole systems, and the risks associated with untreated mental illness in individuals with violent histories. The case became a cautionary tale for lawmakers, social workers, and the general public, highlighting the importance of vigilance, early intervention, and community awareness in preventing family tragedies. Outside the courtroom, the community remembered Amelia and her children for their warmth, creativity, and joy. Memorials and candlelight vigils were held to honor their memory. Flowers, toys, and letters were left at the site of the former Whitman home, transforming a place of horror into one of remembrance and collective mourning. Neighbors and friends recounted stories of Amelia's humor, her late-night phone calls with family, and the imaginative play that defined her children's lives. These memories offered solace amid grief, serving as reminders of the love and life that had been lost. Thomas Whitman remained incarcerated, awaiting trial and the inevitable consequences of his actions. Amelia's family, though deeply wounded, had begun taking steps toward healing, using their experience to advocate for greater awareness of domestic violence and systemic failures that allowed dangerous individuals to live unchecked. While the scars would remain, both literal and emotional, the Whitman family story would continue to inspire conversations about prevention, vigilance, and the complex dynamics of family violence. The trial of Thomas Whitman began under intense public scrutiny. Reporters, community members, and legal observers filled the courtroom daily, each witnessing a case that would haunt the city of Redford, Oregon, for years to come. The weight of the evidence against him was overwhelming, and from the outset, it was clear that the proceedings would be both emotionally charged and legally complex. Prosecutors opened by presenting the horrifying details of the Whitman family massacre. Forensic evidence showed that Thomas had administered lethal doses of melatonin to his children, incapacitating them before stabbing and ultimately trapping them in a fire. He had stabbed his wife Amelia multiple times in a display of rage and obsession, and then attempted to destroy the house to cover his crimes. Each piece of evidence reinforced the premeditated and calculated nature of the murders. The defense attempted to cast doubt, offering a narrative in which Amelia had allegedly endangered the children and Thomas had acted to prevent further harm. They claimed that he had been delusional and mentally unstable at the time, asserting that his actions were influenced by paranoia. However, this defense was quickly undermined by the sheer amount of planning and foresight evident in the crime. Surveillance footage, store receipts, and witness accounts demonstrated that Thomas had carefully timed the attack to occur when Amelia returned home. Experts testified that the deliberate sedation of the children was a clear sign of intent. Witness testimony was particularly compelling. Neighbors described Thomas as increasingly controlling in the months leading up to the murders, monitoring Amelia's movements and frequently becoming agitated when she spoke of separation or divorce. Teachers and babysitters spoke of the Whitman children's creativity, intelligence, and gentle nature, painting a stark contrast to the violent end they met. Friends and relatives described Amelia as a devoted mother who had always prioritized her children's happiness, even amidst challenges in her marriage. Leonard Torres, Amelia's father, took the stand to speak about his daughter and grandchildren. His testimony was emotional but measured, highlighting the profound loss his family had suffered while also emphasizing the importance of seeking justice. He said, "I lost my daughter and 4 grandchildren, but I also want to see the truth recognized and the person responsible held accountable. Thomas Whitman needs to face the consequences for his actions." The court heard from forensic pathologists who detailed the injuries of each family member. Amelia's multiple stab wounds indicated a complete loss of control, but the lack of defensive wounds suggested she was caught off guard and unable to resist effectively. Lucas, Nathan, and Benjamin had suffered similar fates, while Clara's death from the fire illustrated Thomas's reckless disregard for life. The premeditation and combination of sedatives, knives, and fire painted a chilling picture. Thomas had meticulously orchestrated the deaths of his entire family. Throughout the trial, Amelia's family was a constant presence, offering support to one another and bearing witness to the proceedings. Leonard Torres, Miguel Torres, and Rosa Torres maintained a dignified demeanor even as the details of the murders were recounted day after day. They also sought to highlight the failures of the justice system, noting how Thomas's prior convictions should have prevented him from living freely with a family. Their advocacy emphasized the importance of monitoring repeat offenders and protecting vulnerable communities from known threats. As the trial progressed, the prosecution methodically dismantled the defense's arguments. They highlighted inconsistencies in Thomas's statements, including his claims that Amelia had attacked the children. Surveillance footage and phone records proved that Thomas was home during the time of the murders and that Amelia had left the house calmly that morning, unaware of the impending danger. Witness testimony painted Thomas as increasingly obsessive and controlling, fearful of losing his family and resorting to extreme measures to assert dominance. The community followed the trial closely. Local media reported daily updates, and public interest in the case remained high. Citizens expressed outrage at the crimes, but many also focused on the need for systemic change. Advocates for domestic violence awareness, child protection, and mental health reform used the case as a platform to discuss how similar tragedies could be prevented. Community members organized support networks for surviving relatives and for children in high-risk family situations, hoping to transform grief into meaningful action. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. Thomas Whitman was found guilty on all counts: 4 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of arson, and additional charges for felony murder and manslaughter. The verdict was unanimous, reflecting the strength of the prosecution's case and the clarity of the forensic and testimonial evidence. Relief, sorrow, and a sense of justice mingled in the courtroom as the verdict was read. Sentencing followed shortly thereafter. Thomas Whitman received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the gravity of his crimes and the premeditated nature of the murders. The court emphasized the need to protect society from an individual who had demonstrated both extreme violence and a lack of remorse. Legal experts noted that while the death penalty had been considered, the life sentence provided a permanent and unequivocal resolution to the case. For Amelia's family, the sentence was bittersweet. While Thomas would no longer pose a threat, the loss of their daughter and grandchildren was irrevocable. They channeled their grief into advocacy, establishing the Torres Family Memorial Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and preventing family tragedies. The organization provided counseling, educational resources, and community outreach programs, aiming to protect families before violence could escalate. Leonard Torres spoke publicly about his motivations. "I want to honor Amelia and my grandchildren by making sure other families don't have to experience what we did," he said. "Their memory lives on in the work we do, in the awareness we raise, and in the lives we touch. This is the best way to turn our sorrow into something meaningful." Amelia's brother, Miguel, pursued a career in social work inspired by the tragedy. He focused on domestic violence prevention, advocating for early intervention and stronger monitoring of repeat offenders. Rosa Torres, Amelia's sister, became involved in mental health advocacy, highlighting the importance of addressing untreated psychological disorders that can lead to violence if left unchecked. Together, they transformed personal grief into a force for change, determined to prevent other families from suffering similar fates. The legacy of Amelia and her children remained a central focus in the community. Candlelight vigils, memorials, and anniversaries were observed annually, with friends and neighbors recalling the warmth, humor, and creativity of the Whitman family. Letters, flowers, and personal mementos were left at the former home site, creating a lasting tribute to lives tragically cut short. Teachers and classmates of the children spoke fondly of their curiosity, kindness, and imagination, ensuring that the memory of their young spirits endured despite the horror of their deaths. Psychologists studying the case noted the broader societal implications. Family annihilation is rare but devastating, and understanding the warning signs, obsessive behavior, controlling tendencies, and escalation of domestic conflict is crucial. They emphasize that community awareness, proper offender monitoring, and accessible mental health resources could prevent similar tragedies. The Whitman case became a reference point in research on domestic violence, child safety, and the criminal psychology of family annihilators. In the years following the trial, Thomas Whitman remained in prison, serving his life sentence. Letters from advocacy groups and criminologists suggested that he could potentially contribute to programs aimed at educating other inmates about the consequences of unchecked jealousy, control, and violence. While the damage he caused was irrevocable, experts argued that even perpetrators could serve a purpose if guided toward understanding and preventing similar acts. Amelia's family, meanwhile, continued to heal and advocate. They worked closely with local schools, social services, and community groups to promote domestic safety, early intervention, and child protection. Leonard Torres spoke at events, sharing the story of his daughter and grandchildren, while emphasizing actionable steps families and communities could take to prevent violence. Miguel Torres trained new social workers, focusing on domestic violence detection and support systems, while Rosa Torres provided counseling and educational workshops on mental health awareness. The story of Amelia and her children remains a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence and obsession. Their lives, though tragically cut short, have inspired systemic reflection, community action, and advocacy for vulnerable populations. While grief and loss remain ever present, the efforts of Amelia's family have ensured that their legacy is not solely defined by tragedy, but also by resilience, remembrance, and positive change. Ultimately, the Whitman case reflects the duality of human experience, the capacity for unthinkable violence on one side, and the enduring strength of love, memory, and action on the other. Families like Amelia's remind us that even in the wake of horrific loss, the bonds of family, community, and compassion endure. Candlelight vigils, memorial funds, and advocacy programs serve not only to honor those lost, but also to safeguard future generations from similar fates. As the community of Redford continues to remember Amelia, Lucas, Nathan, Benjamin, and Clara, their story lives on as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope. Through education, vigilance, and the dedication of those who loved them, the Whitman family's lives continue to inspire change, showing that even in darkness, the light of remembrance and action can shine brightly. Elena Winters was 18 years old, a senior at Crestwood Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in Portland, Oregon. She lived in an upscale neighborhood near the Willamette River in a modern townhouse valued at over $1 million. Her family was affluent, well-educated, and well-connected, yet behind the manicured lawns and designer interiors, Elena carried a secret that no one suspected. After graduation, Elena enrolled in a gap year program through a Boston-based organization called Global Horizons. According to their promotional materials, the program promised students aged 18 to 22 a chance to explore the world, discover personal passions, and acquire real-life skills while traveling through multiple countries over a full year. The cost was staggering. A single semester ranged from $20,000 to $25,000, and a full year experience could top $45,000. Those who opted for the full year would visit Europe, Southeast Asia, and Australia, combining education, adventure, and cultural immersion. Elena had been selected for semester 2, starting her journey in mid-January, which would take her across France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland before eventually moving to Australia and Thailand. She was excited, ambitious, and curious about the world, but she carried a burden she had not shared with anyone, not her friends, not her family. Elena was pregnant. No one knew. She had kept the pregnancy hidden for months, believing she could handle the situation alone. She did not seek medical attention, confiding in no one, not even her closest friends. Her decision was partially rooted in fear of disappointing her parents, fear of the social consequences among her peers, and a gnawing sense of denial about the reality she faced. Her flight to Paris went smoothly, and her cohort of students arrived at the Hotel Lumière, a mid-range accommodation tucked into the 11th arrondissement. The group was lively, filled with young adults eager to explore the city, sample local cuisine, and absorb as much culture as possible in the limited weeks they had. Elena, however, kept to herself more than usual. She was polite, quiet, and conscientious, but her smiles never quite reached her eyes. On Monday, February 17th, Elena woke in her hotel room with the morning light streaming through the small window. She had stayed up late the night before, reading and journaling, writing about her hopes, her fears, and the choices that had led her here. Today, like every day, she felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her chest. The pregnancy had progressed quickly, and she could no longer ignore the physical reality she had tried to deny. By 6 a.m., tragedy struck. Elena went into labor alone in the hotel room. The cohort members were still asleep. The city outside was quiet. In a state of panic and disbelief, Elena gave birth without medical assistance. She was alone, terrified, and overwhelmed by what had just occurred. The newborn was small, fragile, and breathing weakly. For reasons that remain unclear, Elena did not reach for a phone or alert hotel staff. Instead, in a state of shock and desperation, she wrapped the infant in a towel. Witnesses would later describe the horrifying sequence of events. According to a hotel cleaner, the baby was then thrown from a second-story window, landing in a nearby waste container. The cleaner, arriving for her morning duties, noticed the commotion and immediately contacted local authorities. Paramedics arrived quickly, transferring the newborn to a nearby hospital where doctors did everything possible to revive him. Tragically, he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Elena, meanwhile, was taken to the local hospital for emergency medical care. Following her operation, she was placed in police custody and questioned extensively about her actions. French authorities classified the case as a homicide of a minor under 15 years old, an offense carrying a potential life sentence. In the investigation, officials speculated that the circumstances might involve denial of pregnancy, a rare condition in which a woman is unaware or unable to accept that she is carrying a child. Medical experts note that denial of pregnancy can be either psychotic or non-psychotic. Psychotic denial involves a misinterpretation of pregnancy symptoms, often tied to mental illness. Non-psychotic denial includes affective denial, where a woman intellectually recognizes her pregnancy but does not emotionally accept it, and pervasive denial, in which she is entirely unaware of the pregnancy until labor. Persistent denial is another form, occurring when a woman discovers her pregnancy late in the third trimester but does not seek prenatal care. Risk factors for pregnancy denial include young age, previous psychiatric history, limited education, precarious employment, and being a single mother. Though rare, the consequences can be severe: psychological distress, unassisted delivery, and neonaticide. For Aleda, investigators had to consider whether she had been aware of the pregnancy, whether she had intentionally concealed it, and why she had not sought medical help or explored legal and medical options available in Oregon, where reproductive rights are among the most permissive in the United States. In Oregon, a woman has the right to terminate a pregnancy at any stage without restrictions based on gestational age. Minors do not require parental consent, and state Medicaid provides coverage for services. There is no mandatory waiting period, and pharmacists are authorized to prescribe contraceptives, including short-acting hormonal methods. Emergency contraceptive, including Plan D, is available for individuals age 17 and older, and birth control is accessible regardless of citizenship status for those who qualify. Oregon also has safe haven laws, allowing newborns up to 30 days to be safely surrendered at hospitals, clinics, or police stations without legal repercussions. Even in Paris, where Elena gave birth, there were options for anonymous delivery at hospitals, with the possibility of placing the child for adoption. The evidence suggested that she had choices, multiple legal, medical, and social avenues that could have prevented the tragedy. Yet, whether fear, denial, or psychological crisis led her to act otherwise is still the subject of investigation. The international media quickly picked up the story. Headlines described the incident as shocking, tragic, and unprecedented for a young woman from an affluent American family. Observers drew comparisons to previous cases of neonaticide in Europe and the U.S., such as the case of a German executive who threw her newborn from a window to protect her career, or a New Mexico teenager who gave birth in a hospital bathroom and attempted to hide the child. Each case sparked debates over mental health, reproductive rights, and the social pressures that can drive women to desperate acts. Elena's parents, initially in shock, flew to Paris to provide support to authorities and to deal with their daughter's custody. They struggled to reconcile the image of the cheerful, ambitious girl they had raised with the woman who had taken such drastic and incomprehensible actions. Friends and classmates of Elena expressed disbelief, many citing her intelligence, maturity, and apparent confidence, yet none had suspected the pregnancy, highlighting the silent and often invisible nature of denial. Psychologists consulted by international media emphasized that cases like Elena's are extremely complex. While legal systems must uphold justice and protect children, mental health considerations are critical in understanding the motivations and state of mind of the mother. Pregnancy denial is difficult to predict and even harder to intervene in without awareness. Cases often involve a combination of psychological distress, fear, and situational factors that converge tragically at the moment of labor. As the investigation continued, authorities examined hotel records, communications, and Elena's personal devices. They sought to understand whether the gap year program had any role in her isolation or whether travel stress contributed to her psychological state. While the program offered cultural immersion and personal growth, it also placed students in unfamiliar environments far from family support, potentially exacerbating anxiety, fear, or mental health crises. The local community in Paris reacted with a mixture of horror and sympathy. Witnesses described shock at the incident, while neighbors expressed frustration that a life could be lost under such circumstances. Candlelight vigils were organized near the hotel, attended by concerned residents and members of the American expatriate community, who mourned the loss of the newborn and expressed hope for a just and thorough investigation. By the end of the first part of the investigation, the picture was clear in broad strokes: an affluent young woman on a once-in-a-lifetime gap year, a hidden pregnancy, a solitary birth, and a tragic decision that resulted in the death of her child. Yet the deeper questions remained. Why had she hidden the pregnancy? Did she understand the consequences of her actions? Could this have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier? And critically, how would the legal system in France address a case with such rare and complex psychological factors? Elena's story serves as a chilling reminder of the hidden struggles some young women face, even when they appear privileged and supported. As the world awaited answers, the tragedy ignited discussions on reproductive rights, mental health, and the responsibilities of parents, educators, and society to ensure that young people do not face such crises in isolation. Following the shocking events at the Hotel Lumière, Elena Winters was placed under strict police custody in Paris. French authorities operating under the Code Penal classified the case as the homicide of a minor under 15 years old, an offense that carries a potential life sentence. From the moment she arrived at the police station, Elena remained calm on the surface, but internally she was a storm of conflicting emotions: fear, guilt, and denial. Investigators were careful in their approach, aware that the circumstances could involve a psychological condition known as pregnancy denial, a rare but documented phenomenon. Initially, authorities questioned Elena extensively about her actions in the hours leading up to the birth. She described vague symptoms, stomach discomfort, and fatigue, but insisted that she had no idea she was pregnant. Investigators noted that her account included significant contradictions, with her recalling certain details while seeming to forget or minimize others. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate her mental state, and the preliminary assessment suggested that Elena could be experiencing pervasive denial, a condition in which a woman is largely or entirely unaware of her pregnancy until labor begins. Pervasive denial, as explained by the psychologists, can last until the third trimester or even until delivery. It often occurs in individuals with no prior psychiatric history and can involve an intellectual recognition of a pregnancy without any emotional acknowledgement. In Elena's case, her age, the sudden onset of physical symptoms, and her isolation abroad likely compounded the psychological impact. Experts emphasize that such a condition does not absolve one of legal responsibility entirely, but can be a significant mitigating factor in court proceedings. Media coverage in the United States and Europe exploded. Headlines described Elena as the Portland teen abroad who committed an unthinkable act, and social media was flooded with commentary ranging from outrage to sympathy. Many focused on the fact that Elena came from an affluent background, arguing that her circumstances removed many of the barriers that might have led someone in poverty or lacking education to make desperate choices. Critics emphasized that she had access to reproductive health care, legal abortion services in her home state of Oregon, and safe haven options both in the U.S. and in France. Within days, the Global Horizons program released an official statement expressing shock and sorrow. A spokesperson said the organization was cooperating fully with authorities and providing counseling support to all participants who witnessed or were affected by the incident. They emphasized that the program included extensive orientation and guidance, but acknowledged that unforeseen crises could still occur despite precautions. As investigators pieced together Elena's movements, it became clear that she had meticulously concealed her pregnancy. Hotel staff recalled her being careful with clothing choices, often wearing oversized jackets and layered outfits. She had avoided pool or beach excursions and had declined physical activities that might have drawn attention. Her communications with family were limited and neutral in tone. She had not disclosed anything to her friends or travel companions. This level of secrecy reinforced the psychological complexity of the case as authorities tried to determine whether her actions stemmed from conscious intent, panic, or psychological denial. French legal experts began analyzing how the case might proceed. In France, homicide of a minor carries severe penalties, but the legal system also considers psychological and situational factors. Elena's defense attorneys prepared to argue that her actions were the result of extreme psychological distress and denial of pregnancy, emphasizing that she had no prior history of violence and that the act occurred in a state of panic and confusion. They also highlighted the contrast between her upbringing, her access to information, and the sudden isolation abroad as contributing factors. Comparisons were drawn to similar cases internationally. One frequently cited example involved a German executive, Katerina Jovanovic, who had thrown her newborn from an apartment window in 2024. Katerina initially admitted to the act, but later claimed she had not realized she was pregnant. The court ultimately found her guilty, reasoning that she had consciously concealed the pregnancy and prioritized her career over the child's life. Another high-profile case was that of Alexi Treviso in New Mexico, a high school student who gave birth in a hospital bathroom and attempted to hide her newborn in a trash receptacle. Alexi's actions drew widespread media attention, highlighting how denial, fear, and secrecy can intersect in devastating ways. During the early weeks of the investigation, French authorities conducted interviews with Elena's family, her travel companions, and program staff. They examined hospital records, correspondence, and her personal devices for evidence of planning, concealment, or intent. Despite intense scrutiny, no evidence suggested premeditation in the sense of deliberate harm. Instead, patterns emerged that aligned more closely with psychological denial, panic, and poor judgment in an unfamiliar environment. The public response remained divided. Some commentators argued that Elena's socioeconomic privilege meant she had the ability to make informed choices and should be held fully accountable. Others emphasized the complexity of mental health and pregnancy denial, noting that isolation, fear, and panic could overwhelm even individuals with access to resources. Advocacy groups for women's mental health called for compassion and a careful consideration of psychological evidence, stressing that extreme anxiety, dissociation, and denial are documented conditions that deserve attention alongside legal scrutiny. Elena's parents, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile their love for their daughter with the horror of her actions. They were interviewed by the media outlets, speaking cautiously and emphasizing that Elena had always been intelligent, responsible, and compassionate. They described her as someone who had quietly carried burdens alone in the past, making it plausible that she could conceal a pregnancy without anyone suspecting. Their statements were met with empathy by some and skepticism by others, reflecting the tension inherent in such high-profile cases. Psychologists preparing testimony for the trial delved into the rare nuances of denial of pregnancy. They noted that the condition is estimated to occur in roughly 1 in 475 pregnancies by 20 weeks, with a proportion of cases persisting to delivery at around 1 in 25,500. Consequences can include emotional trauma, unassisted delivery, and neonaticide. In Elena's case, pervasive denial appeared likely, but the defense also acknowledged the potential role of fear, isolation, and a lack of preparation for childbirth in an unfamiliar setting. The prosecution, conversely, framed the case around the principle of legal responsibility. They emphasized that Elena had multiple avenues to avoid tragedy, including medical consultation, confidential reproductive services in Oregon, and safe surrender options both in the U.S. and in France. As the case prepared to go to trial, the international spotlight intensified. Social media campaigns emerged both in support and against Elena, with hashtags debating mental health, reproductive rights, and legal culpability. Legal analysts and journalists followed developments closely, drawing attention to the broader implications of pregnancy denial and the responsibilities of young women, families, and institutions in preventing such tragedies. Counselors provided support to Elena's travel companions, many of whom were traumatized by witnessing or discovering the aftermath. Students described feeling unprepared to handle emergencies of this magnitude and expressed ongoing distress at the sudden, violent reality of what occurred. The Global Horizons program increased its mental health resources in response, acknowledging that exposure to trauma, even indirectly, can have lasting effects. Throughout the investigation, authorities considered international legal principles, psychological research, and the ethical complexities of prosecuting cases involving extreme distress and mental health crises. The defense team worked to gather expert testimony on denial of pregnancy, including case studies, medical journals, and psychological evaluations, while the prosecution sought to emphasize personal responsibility and the preventability of the tragedy. By the time court proceedings began, Elena had become a symbol in the media for the intersection of privilege, mental health, and legal accountability. Analysts debated whether her upbringing and access to resources increased her culpability or whether her psychological state mitigated the severity of her actions. Her case sparked broader discussions about reproductive education, parental communication, and the pressures faced by young women navigating independence, mental health, and secrecy. The first day of trial was intense. The courtroom was packed with journalists, mental health experts, legal observers, and members of the public. Testimony included statements from hotel staff, paramedics, psychologists, and family members. The prosecution highlighted the preventability of the tragedy and the harm inflicted upon a defenseless infant, while the defense focused on Elena's mental state, panic, and denial. Evidence included her travel diary, hospital records, and communications with family and friends. One psychologist described the moment of labor. Elena experienced a dissociative state consistent with pervasive pregnancy denial. Her perception of reality was fragmented, and her actions, while tragically harmful, were the result of a psychological crisis rather than deliberate intent to endanger her child. Other experts cautioned, however, that even extreme distress does not remove all legal responsibility. Outside the courtroom, public reaction continued to swirl. Advocacy groups called for awareness of pregnancy denial and support for young women at risk, while others expressed frustration at what they perceived as a lack of accountability. The debate highlighted the complex intersection of mental health, reproductive rights, social support, and legal consequences, a combination rarely addressed so publicly and vividly. As Part 2 of Elena's story closes, the trial looms as a crucible for understanding the full scope of her actions. The next stage will determine whether French law prioritizes psychological mitigation, societal context, or strict accountability. It will also explore the long-term impact on Elena, her family, and the broader conversation about mental health, secrecy, and the responsibilities of young adults facing crises abroad. Elena's case is a chilling reminder of how hidden struggles, fear, and lack of support can intersect in tragic ways. Despite her youth, privilege, and access to resources, the combination of denial, isolation, and panic led to an event that shocked both her immediate community and the world. The legal and social reverberations will unfold, where the trial verdict, public reactions, and reflections on prevention, accountability, and the limits of psychological defense will be revealed. By the time the courtroom reconvened for the final stages of Elena Winter's trial, tension had reached a near breaking point. The public and press had been following every development, and discussions about pregnancy denial, mental health, and parental responsibility filled news cycles on both sides of the Atlantic. Inside the Paris courthouse, Elena sat quietly, listening to her attorneys present the closing arguments. Their tone was calm but resolute, emphasizing both her mental state and the unique pressures she faced as an 18-year-old traveling alone abroad. The defense's final argument centered on pervasive pregnancy denial, arguing that Elena was psychologically incapable of understanding the full implications of her pregnancy or the potential outcomes of her actions at the moment she gave birth. They called on multiple expert witnesses, psychologists, psychiatrists, and medical professionals, all of whom testified that Elena's behavior aligned with documented cases of pervasive denial. One expert explained that individuals in such a state may intellectually recognize that they are pregnant, yet fail to internalize that reality, resulting in behaviors that appear irrational to outsiders but are consistent with a psychological state. The defense also highlighted her lack of preparation and isolation abroad. Unlike women who experience pregnancy in familiar surroundings with family or trusted support systems, Elena had been alone with peers who, while friendly, could not recognize the subtle signs of her pregnancy. The stress of navigating unfamiliar environments, compounded by academic and social expectations from the gap year program, created a situation where panic and denial became overwhelming. Her attorneys argued that while the outcome was tragic, it was not the result of deliberate intent to harm her child. Conversely, the prosecution painted a starkly different picture. They emphasized that Elena had multiple avenues to prevent the tragedy. As a young woman from Oregon, she had access to reproductive health care, counseling services, and legal abortion, as well as safe haven laws that would have allowed her to surrender a newborn anonymously and legally in the United States. While she was abroad, the prosecution noted, she could have contacted authorities, a doctor, or even a member of her travel program for help. They framed her actions not as the product of psychological denial, but a failure of judgment compounded by secrecy and fear. Prosecutors also drew parallels to previous cases, such as Alexei Treviso in New Mexico and Katerina Yovanovitch in Germany. In both cases, defendants attempted to conceal pregnancies and gave birth in unsafe conditions, resulting in injury or death of the infant. In these cases, courts had weighed psychological factors, yet ultimately held the defendants accountable for their actions. The prosecution argued that the same principle applied to Elena. Regardless of her mental state, she had a responsibility to seek help when a newborn's life was at stake. The courtroom was tense as the jury deliberated. Outside, journalists speculated on possible outcomes, with opinions divided between those advocating for leniency due to psychological distress and those calling for a strict sentence to reflect the severity of the crime. Social media amplified the debate, with hashtags trending about pregnancy denial, mental health in young adults, and parental responsibility. Public discourse often veered into polarized positions, illustrating the complexities of cases where law, psychology, and morality intersect. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Elena Winters was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder, reflecting the court's recognition of her psychological state while acknowledging the preventable nature of the infant's death. The decision struck a delicate balance between accountability and compassion, considering both the legal standards in France and the mitigating circumstances of pervasive pregnancy denial. The sentence handed down was 15 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10 years, combined with mandatory psychiatric treatment and ongoing counseling. The verdict sparked immediate reactions. Advocacy groups for women's mental health praised the court for recognizing the psychological complexities involved, emphasizing that denial of pregnancy is a rare but serious condition requiring public awareness. Legal experts highlighted that the ruling could set a precedent for future cases involving psychological factors in infant-related incidents, particularly where extreme distress and isolation play a role. On the other hand, public outrage remained strong in some circles. Critics argued that 15 years was too lenient, asserting that regardless of psychological conditions, Elena had consciously taken an infant's life and that justice required a more severe response. Debates raged over whether socioeconomic privilege influenced both the legal defense and public sympathy, highlighting ongoing tensions between law, class, and perceptions of fairness in the justice system. Elena's family issued a statement after the verdict, expressing both relief that the sentence considered her mental state and sorrow for the loss of the child. They emphasized the importance of mental health support for young adults, particularly those navigating transitions such as leaving home for extended travel. The family requested privacy and asked the media to respect their grief, underscoring the deeply personal impact of publicized cases of this nature. The case also prompted widespread discussion about preventive measures. Mental health professionals and educators emphasized the need for early education about reproductive health, pregnancy recognition, and coping mechanisms for stress and isolation. Experts highlighted that open dialogue between parents and teenagers, access to confidential healthcare services, and programs supporting young women abroad could mitigate risks in similar scenarios. Lessons drawn from Elena's case underscored the interplay between psychological vulnerability, societal pressures, and the critical importance of awareness and intervention. In addition to legal and psychological analyses, the tragedy also shed light on the role of institutions in protecting vulnerable individuals. Travel programs, schools, and universities were urged to enhance support systems for students, including access to confidential medical advice, counseling services, and emergency response protocols. The Global Horizons program, in particular, pledged to review its policies, improve orientation about health risks, and increase mental health support for participants traveling internationally. While the legal proceedings concluded, the emotional impact on peers and community remained. Those who had witnessed the events or were involved indirectly struggled with feelings of guilt, fear, and grief. Counseling services provided by the program and local mental health organizations were critical in helping students process trauma, emphasizing that support networks and psychological care are essential in the aftermath of such events. Elena herself underwent extensive psychiatric evaluation and treatment during her incarceration. Psychologists worked with her to process the trauma of the incident, understand the psychological mechanisms that led to pervasive pregnancy denial, and develop coping strategies for guilt and stress. While the legal system imposed a sentence, mental health treatment aimed to address the underlying factors that contributed to the tragedy, highlighting the importance of combining justice with rehabilitation. Internationally, the case contributed to a broader understanding of rare psychological conditions. Medical journals, legal analyses, and news outlets published in-depth discussions on pervasive pregnancy denial, highlighting that it can occur even in well-educated, privileged individuals with access to information and resources. Researchers emphasized the need for greater awareness and the potential for early intervention, advocating for public education campaigns and professional training for healthcare providers, educators, and counselors. As time passed, Elena's story became a case study in both law and psychology, cited in academic articles and legal discussions about the limits of responsibility, mental health defenses, and preventive strategies. Her case illustrated that tragic outcomes are not always the result of malicious intent, but often stem from complex intersections of fear, denial, isolation, and insufficient support systems. The long-term societal impact of the case extended beyond Elena herself. Schools and travel organizations implemented programs to educate young adults about reproductive health, psychological awareness, and emergency response. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight the importance of accessible support for young women, particularly those in new or stressful environments. Legal scholars debated the balance between accountability and mitigation, examining how the court navigated the rare intersection of infant homicide and pervasive pregnancy denial. While Elena serves her sentence, ongoing reflection continues regarding how similar tragedies might be prevented. Experts stress that education, communication, mental health awareness, and access to reproductive health care are all critical tools in reducing the risk of neonaticide and related incidents. They also emphasize that legal consequences, while necessary, are only one aspect of a broader societal response that must include support, intervention, and preventive measures. In conclusion, the story of Elena Winters is both tragic and instructive. It highlights the devastating consequences that can occur when psychological conditions, fear, and secrecy intersect. At the same time, it underscores the importance of awareness, intervention, and education in preventing similar tragedies. While the legal system imposed a sentence reflecting both accountability and mitigation, the broader lessons extend far beyond the courtroom. They serve as a reminder that access to mental health care, reproductive services, and social support is not merely a matter of policy, but a matter of life and death. Ultimately, Elena's case leaves a complex legacy, a sobering example of how hidden struggles can escalate into tragedy, a cautionary tale for institutions and families, and a call to action for society to better understand, support, and protect those navigating extreme psychological and social pressures. The hope is that future cases can be prevented through awareness, communication, and timely intervention, ensuring that young adults facing similar circumstances are guided towards life-saving options rather than despair and irreversible decisions.